Namaste and greetings. I, Fiza Mahajan, visiting researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान, Nai Delhi, extend a warm welcome to you all for joining us today for second day of the Feminist Foreign Policy Fellowship, an online international winter school program. This 3-month Immersive Leadership Certificate Training Fellowship is proudly brought to you by the IMPRI, Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies, and the IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center in collaboration with the Asia Foundation. Our chair for this program is Professor Vibhuti Patel ji, visiting distinguished professor at IMPRI and former professor at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, TIS, Mumbai. We are grateful for her continued guidance and leadership. The experts for today are Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya, retired professor, International Relations, Jadavpur University, Kolkata, and visiting professor at IMPRI, and Dr. Keshab Giri, lecturer in International Relations at the University of St. Andrews, and research fellow at WAPPP, Harvard Kennedy School. We will share the video recordings of each session to support flexible learning at your convenience. The guidelines document will be emailed to you after the session for your perusal. Now, before we start today's session, I would like to announce the housekeeping rules. It is imperative that you join the meeting on time. There will be a Q&A session after each presentation. Share your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. The questions must not be posted as an anonymous attendee. Ensure that your questions are precise and refrain from making general comments in the question to save time. Now, I am honored to call upon our first expert for today, Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya, retired professor, International Relations, Jadavpur University, Kolkata, and visiting professor at IMPRI, who will address us on the topic Feminist Foreign Policy, Origins and Trajectory in Theory and Practice. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. May I have the PowerPoint, please?
Yes, ma'am.
I had sent the PowerPoint. Can you put that up?
Yes, ma'am. We'll share it.
Yeah.
Just give us a moment. We'll just share it.
Okay, sharing.
I think there is some glitch, ma'am. Please give us a moment. We'll be sharing soon.
Okay, I can try from here, but
Yeah, okay. Well, okay. I think we have opening remarks with Vibhuti ma'am also.
Yeah, okay, I can do that. Yeah.
Yes.
So first of all, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to the conveners of this program, Ms. Nandita Barua and Ms. Apurva Singh from the Asia Foundation, and Dr. Arjun Kumar and Dr. Simi Mehta from IMPRI, and also coordinators, Mr. Satyam Tripathi, Ms. Vithita Jha, Ms. Sweta, and also today's moderator, Ms. Fiza Mahajan. The first day, we discussed very important concerns about feminist foreign policy, and we were also happy that we got a tremendous response for this course. 1,100 applications came, and after shortlisting, 90 were selected. And Dr. Simi Mehta provided profile of previous 2 courses on feminist foreign policy and reported that this course also has an extremely important component segment of the society, especially the professionals who are concerned about international relations and geopolitics and political science and interdisciplinary perspective and feminist and from the gender lens were present. Ms. Nandita Barua, in her erudite opening remark, began with the introduction to Asia Foundation, an international development agency with country office in 19 Asian countries. She pointed out that political discourses on feminist foreign policy are relatively new for the global South. She emphasized that the issues of diversity, equity, national security, foreign policy, securitization must be embedded in feminist foreign policy with gender and intersectional lenses. She said that initially feminist foreign policy was driven by larger framing from the global north, and the massive Beijing conference in 1995 with agenda of action where the delegates from the developing countries and Asia, Africa, and Latin America, they also found the importance of feminist foreign policy. And she also told that if we are talking about the policy for implementation of policy and the action agenda, we need gender responsive budgeting. And the first time it was piloted and tested and developed in the southern countries after in post 1995. She concluded with the confidence and said that now it is a time to push the envelope slightly harder as the nation states are polarized in their approach. After that, I gave a genesis of transnational feminist solidarity during 80s and 90s and the interactions at a regional level, national level, regional level, and global level, and also so many agreed documents that came up, such as Nairobi Forward-Looking Strategy, International Convention on Population and Development, CEDAW, and also the anger against stabilization policies and structural adjustment programs which were imposed on the developing countries, and lot of solidarity emerged. So representation of women in foreign policy decision making and development assistance for empowerment of women becomes very important. The keynote address by Ms. Stephenie Foster, who is a diplomat, was started with a very enthusiastic statement that we are in an exciting time in the field of feminist foreign policy, and the UN and other multilateral bodies accept the earlier frameworks in particular were developed, leaving 50% of the population, that means women. So this conversation and the country-specific discussion and the different ways of intervention, which brought to the fore 4 constructs. One is a gender equality as a goal and strategy, broadened definition of security that includes food, health, refugee state, condition of refugees, and support to solidarity with the refugees, internationally displaced people, and climate refugees. And the question of human security. Third one was the elevation of diverse voices. So intersectionality, it becomes very important guiding principle. And the fourth one was addressing historical power imbalances. That means the defense spending versus social sector spending, the whole campaign against waiving of debt of the developing countries, especially the poor African countries. She also narrated that the historical context and there are many layers and foundations of foundations for feminist foreign policy that encompass human rights, women's rights, peace movement, women, peace, security, WPS agenda, and key international agreements around women's concern. She also jokingly said that pale male and YEL, quote unquote, established International Monetary Fund, World Bank, General Agreement of Trade and Tariff, and all global institutions. So currently only 16 to 18 countries have feminist foreign policy and the feminist trade policy or feminist development policy. And these countries are serious about representation, resources, and rights for gender equality. So after that was followed by a highly engaging Q&A session for more than 90 minutes. And I think that itself shows that how proactive today our participants are and how studied they are. Even their questions reflect that they are seriously engaging with this subject. So now today we have equally competent and erudite Professor with Sanjukta Bhattacharya and Dr. Keshab Giri, who will enlighten us further on a very different aspects, because so many questions were asked about the theorization, theories and practice, and also decolonial feminist future, which they are going to deliberate upon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the opening remarks and for gratefully summarizing the pointers from the last session. Now, I would be honored to call upon our first expert, Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya, retired professor, International Relations, Jadavpur University, Kolkata, and visiting professor at IMPRI, who will address us on the topic Feminist Foreign Policy, Origins and Trajectory in Theory and Practice. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Fiza. At first, in fact, before starting, let me thank IMPRI and the Asia Foundation for inviting me to speak at this session of Feminist Foreign Policy Fellowship Program. My special thanks, of course, go out to Dr. Arjun Kumar, to Professor Vibhuti Patel, and to Dr. Simi Mehta, who have been inviting me again and again for talking on different aspects. In fact, I have spoken earlier at different cohorts on different aspects. But today, in fact, I wish to focus on the theoretical origins and underpinning of FFP. I also wish to point out the tweak that you can see in my title, where I have talked about policies and not really policy, because no two foreign policies are alike, let alone feminist foreign policy. There are multiple theories of feminism and feminist international relations, just as there are various theories of international relations and concepts of foreign policy. First, I will, in this talk, briefly overview IR theories and place the origins of feminist international relations in the theoretical context, because without an understanding of the theoretical underpinnings of feminist foreign policy, one cannot truly fathom what countries which adopt a version of feminist foreign policy intend to do. And we can also fail to understand the trajectory of FFP in a world where conflict seems to be endemic. I will then briefly explain the institutionalization of feminist IR in international law, and finally attempt to trace the ways in which at least portions of FFP, the ideals that are presented as feminist foreign policy, can be put into practice. First, next slide, please. What is the purpose of foreign policy? Next slide, please. What is the purpose of foreign policy? Very broadly, it is the policy where that a state's administrators, read in fact the prevailing political government, undertakes to further the state's interests, which are derived from its geography, history, economy, and distribution of international power. Safeguarding national independence, security, and integrity, that is territorial, political, economic, and even moral, nowadays that is very important, are viewed as a country's primary obligations in foreign policy, followed by preserving a wide freedom of action for the state. Traditionally, political leaders who devised foreign policy pursue what they perceive to be the state's interests, adjusting national policies to changes in external conditions, technology, and internal capacities. So therefore, the foreign policy that we see in countries all over the world today, they're very different from what they were during the Cold War. Things have changed, the external conditions have changed, and so, of course, and internal capacities have also changed. So foreign policies, well, this is just a cartoon where, in fact, oil is seen as, all right, as such by the United States as important. And of course, you can recognize who's there. Next slide, please. This is about IR theory. Next slide. IR theories from early times, going beyond Machiavelli and Kautilya, have theorized on what is in the so-called national interest of the state. These theories can broadly be categorized into three prominent paradigms: realism, liberalism, and constructivism, although these are by no means the only ones. Realism suggests that international relations is driven by competition between states, and therefore the emphasis is on economic and military power. Structural realists hold that the world is organized in an anarchic system, a kind of Hobbesian state of nature, where states should seek peace but prepare for war, because anarchy persists and war is inevitable. This makes national security a kind of zero-sum game where gain by one is basically at the cost, inevitably, of loss by another. Liberalism suggests that states can peacefully coexist. And here, let me give you three subgroups of liberalism. Liberal nationalism puts forth the ability of global institutions to eventually coax states into getting along. The example being the UN as a form of mediation and dispute settlement and respect for international law. Liberal commercialism sees advances of global commerce as making war less likely. Liberal internationalism argues that democracies are less likely to make war, if only because making war will may be unpopular to the people and they can be voted out of power in the next elections. Constructivism argues that culture, social structure, and human institutional frameworks matter, and it relies in part on the theory of a social construction of reality. Apart from these, there are Marxist and neo-Marxist theories of IR that insist that capitalism drives states to compete and dominate each other. But here, let me point to the anomaly of China, which declares itself to be a communist country, but is actually driven by state-sponsored capitalism and seeks its national interest in competition for economic and military power abroad. So this, of course, is very different from what traditionally is Marxist theory. At another end of the spectrum are the critical analysis of IR, ranging from communitarianism to cosmopolitanism, that discuss the tension between status obligation to co-nationalists, their own kind of people, and cosmopolitan duties to distant others. Yet, what you find is that scholarship on ethical foreign policy, all the theories of IR that I have mentioned, almost entirely lack of focus on gender justice, and in fact are largely gender neutral. Next slide, please. And in fact, this is where the feminist questioning of IR theory and practice began. Where are the women in international relations? They are half the population of the world, and from time immemorial, the most exploited victims of war and even foreign policy, and yet they are invisible in IR theory and practice of foreign policy. In fact, even in India, if you really look back, women were used as what? Variables in foreign policy. We all know about Jodhabai and why there was no war between Jodhpur and the Mughal Empire, the Samrat. Well, women were used as pawns, all right, as such, to bring about peace. Okay, as such. Okay. So, and this is only one part of the story. I mean, women being enslaved, women as the victims of war, women basically as the trophies of war, all right, as such. Well, there's a completely different set of theories regarding all that, so I'm not going to that. But what I'm saying is that they are, despite all this, and today, of course, I mean, you look at this, your body, my choice, all right? Then the great cry of women's liberation rises after the Beijing conference. But what is the response? I have a headache here. Okay, so basically they are not very interesting. And look at the one just above that. We need more women in management. Simpkins, get a sex change. Okay, so these are of course cartoons, but I mean they speak very well about what. And look at this one from India. Oh, she doesn't work. She's a housewife. Okay, so well there you are. And the other one which is there is of course women going up the ladder men go up the ladder quite easily, but women, of course, I mean, look at the difference. Okay. Next slide, please. So basically, women began questioning liberalism, realism, constructivism because of all this. And what you find is women IR theorists began their questioning from about 1980s, but it may be also said that feminist IR is largely indebted to the second wave of feminist movement in the 1960s and 1970s, which were the harbingers of feminist theories that analyze sex and gender in social construction to be transformed rather than facts of nature to be taken for granted. Feminist theories and feminist IR theories are seen as essential forms of feminist practice that could challenge male domination of academic knowledge. And I'm mentioning specifically academic knowledge because I'm talking about theories. The journal Millennium was the first to publish a specialist on women in international relations in 1988. And in a follow-up issue in 1991, the editors, Grant and Newland, contended that IR was, and I'm quoting, exclusively focused on conflict and anarchy and a way of practicing strategic and practicing statecraft and formulating strategy that is excessively focused on competition and fear. And they felt that this singular focus impoverished the field of IR and urged that IR had neglected studies of norms, ideas, and processes such as structural violence, including poverty, environmental injustice, and socio-political inequality that many scholars agree are the root causes of international conflict and insecurity. Many feminist contributions in the 1990s to Millennium, like those of Ann Tickner, Spike Peterson, Christine Sylvester, to name a few, contested the exclusivity, state-centric, and positivist nature of the discipline. They sought to deconstruct and subvert realism, which was the dominant power politics approach to IR, and some, like Anne Runyon and Spike Peterson, even argued that women's lives on the margins of world politics offered us a less biased and more rationalistic underpinning or understanding of IR, given their distance from dominant institutions and elite power. Feminist scholars and gender analysis to deconstruct the theoretical framework of IR and reveal the bias pervading key concepts like power, security, and sovereignty can be found in plenty around this period. They argued that these concepts identified specifically with masculinity and men's experiences of and knowledge derived from an exclusive man-dominated public sphere. Paying attention to women as well as men's experiences in war and peace, feminist scholars like Cynthia Enlow and Ann Tickner urged that international security be redefined. In fact, 2 decades later, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War had far-reaching implications not only for international relations per se, but for dominant realist theories focused on power politics, which in fact had not predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. This opened the way for new approaches to understanding global politics, including critical and explicitly normative perspectives like feminism. Next slide, please. At the same time, women's movements gained foothold in the UN, mobilizing global alliances of Western and non-Western women activists, scholars, and policymakers. A number of international conferences were held, and I've been told that you have already know about them, so I'm just going to summarize. 1975 was the UNGA conference, followed a decade later by Nairobi in 1985, which added development and peace to the women's agenda. And then there was Beijing 1995, which asserted that women's rights were human rights and in fact committed particular action in respect of these rights. In fact, international feminist networks used their substantive experiences and expertise in gender relations through basically critical argumentation and evidence-based research to engage institutional processes, so much so that by the turn of the century, some extremely important conventions and resolutions were passed that are the building blocks of feminist foreign policies. The UNGA passed the International Bill of Rights of Women in 1979, followed by the adoption of the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, CEDAW, in 1979. And of course, in 2000 comes the UNSC Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, which addresses the impact of war on women and the importance of women's full and equal participation in conflict resolution, peace building, peacekeeping, humanitarian reform, and post-conflict reconstitution. It also called for special measures to protect women and girls from conflict-related sexual violence and outlined gender-related responsibilities of the UN in different political and pragmatic areas. This resolution, 1325, is therefore an underpinning of feminist foreign policies, acknowledging the need to adopt a gender perspective during conflict, repatriation, reintegration, and post-conflict reconstruction, emphasizing the importance of women's equal involvement in peace and security. However, it needs to be mentioned that as of 2024, only 101 UN member states have drawn up national action plans as encouraged by the UNSC to fulfill the resolution's objectives, and even fewer have allocated funding, which is very important. One must also mention, and lastly here, is the Sustainable Development Goal number 5 of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls by 2030. In fact, by the end of the last millennium, it looked as if feminists had more success engaging international institutions than in influencing the discipline of IR, and therefore foreign policy. Next slide, please. Then came the horrific events of September 11th, 2001, and the war on terrorism. These changed the relatively propitious environment for innovative and radical approach to IR, where feminist scholars and activists had largely focused on the gender dimensions of international political economy and the effects of economic globalization. After 9/11, the emphasis of feminist IR analysis shifted to international security. In fact, all IR theories, in fact, shifted to international security. However, unlike the other IR theories, feminist analysis sought to understand the gendered roots of terrorism in underlying political and economic inequalities and in the construction of masculinity in Western or non-Western contexts that contributed to global insecurities. Next slide, please. Here, in fact, let me briefly again go into IR theory. Next slide, please, to see how far IR theories, feminist IR theories, underpin feminist foreign policies. There are several feminist theoretical approaches to IR, but here I will highlight only three major viewpoints. Firstly, the epistemological stance. Secondly, feminist gender relations. And thirdly, feminist normative approaches to IR. And in fact, I will kind of mix up all of these together. In debates on feminist IR, much emphasis has been placed on the distinction between feminist standpoint theory and postmodern feminism. Following Marxism, feminist standpoint asserts that a stronger, more objective perspective on social reality can be gained from taking the standpoint of marginalized political subjects, historically women, who by virtue of their dominated position tend to be less ideologically vested in maintaining the status quo. This is counterposed by a postmodern feminist stance, which problematizes the feminist standpoint assumption that women's experiences of oppression in social hierarchies can constitute the basis for critical knowledge, and argue that this standpoint tends to homogenize differences among women and reinforce gender stereotypes. Influenced by third world, post-colonial, postmodern, Black and lesbian feminist critiques, some IR feminists now posit a plural rather than a singular feminist standpoint, on international relations. While maintaining a belief in the value of feminist and gender perspective, they shift attention away from the subject of women only, employing epistemological strategies of deconstruction, displacement, and distraction. Postmodern feminists seek to disrupt universalizing feminist narratives of women and gender in IR theory and practice. Contrary to this deconstructionist approach to knowledge and building on pluralist standpoint approach, some feminist IR theorists advocate, in fact, a dialogic approach to construct, in fact, a global feminism perspective, which critically scrutinizes the condition of exclusion and in order to bring about the emancipation of all subjects, feminists and non-feminists. Although this too is a destabilizing epistemology, dialogic feminists seek to overcome post-colonial and postmodern critiques through an ethical stance that involves entering into constructive conversations with marginalized others. This involves an ethical commitment to deconstructing one's own position of privilege, which, while actively working to transform power relations that support this position. Next slide, please. There is also the feminist, next slide, feminist empiricists who accept the conventional ontology of IR as given, treating gender as a variable that helps to explain state behavior in an anarchic system. For example, feminist researchers like Goldstein show that states with the greatest domestic inequality between men and women are more likely to go to war or engage in state-sanctioned violence than states with near gender equality. This is a kind of new feminist approach, and this is at odds with much of IR feminism that uses gender not as a variable, but as an analytical tool to challenge realist IR's reductionist concept of the state and its security practice. Another feminist variation with respect to ontology concerns the treatment of gender relative to other categories of oppression such as race, ethnicity, nationality, class, and security. Progressively, IR feminists have moved away from binary concepts of gender to explore the plural masculinities and feminities in global politics. In fact, more recently, some feminists have gone further to look at gender in the intersection of various forms of subordination. Intersectional analysis of gender marks a paradigm shift away from the monolithic representation of gender relations as the patriarchal domination of women by man, without regard to race, ethnicity, and sexual and colonial hierarchies. Gender analysis no longer refers to the singular axis of difference between women and men. It opens up multiple axes of difference: poor, minority, migrant and refugee women and girls, who have often fallen through the categories of feminist and IR theories, global policy, and international law. Next slide. Next slide. Now, why have I devoted so much time to feminist IR theory? The answer is that it is because we are talking about feminist foreign policies. States, basically, for instance, you say that Russia or the US have a realist foreign policy, okay? And some states like Sweden had a feminist foreign policy. So basically, we have to understand what is feminist foreign policy, and without understanding the theorization, the IR theorization, we cannot really understand what is basically FFP. Now, basically, there is also the issue about the trajectory of feminist foreign policies in a world where wars continue, and there are also predictions of total war in years to come. And basically, I just read an article in Foreign Policy where they say that total war is inevitable, okay, in years to come. So here, by understanding feminism or feminist theories and gender analysis, which underpin feminist foreign policies, we can also guess at the trajectory of FFP. Next slide, please. There is no proper definition of feminist foreign policy, primarily because the countries which have adopted FFPs have only adopted certain facets of what IR feminists think of a FFP. But let me give a definition here. Basically, this definition has been cited again and again. So I've given two, and there are other actually, but they're all being cited by uh, members or writers, all right, of the International Center for Research on Women, ICRW. Let me just read it out. Feminist foreign policy is the policy of a state that defines its interactions with other states, as well as movements and other non-state actors in a manner that prioritizes peace, gender equality, and environmental integrity, enshrines, promotes, and protects the human rights of all, seeks to disrupt colonial, racist, patriarchal, and male-dominated power structures, and allocates significant resources, including research, to achieve that vision. Feminist foreign policy is coherent in its approach across all of its levers of influence, anchored by the exercise of those values at home, and co-created with feminist activists, groups, and movements at home and abroad. Now, let me break this down. As per this definition, FFP would A, recognize the goals of peace, gender equality, environmental integrity, human rights, decolonization, uh, anti-racism, disruption of patriarchal, male-dominated political structures. B, be built through consultation and consensus between multiple stakeholders, including state and non-state actors, regarding its principles, goals, approaches, and beneficiaries. C, that is the third point, be intersectional in its approach to countering multiple sources of marginalization and power asymmetries, colonialism, racism, patriarchy, male domination, and finally D, be consistent across multiple sectors of foreign policy, that is aid, trade, environment, defense, infrastructure balance or imbalance, immigration, etc., and all levels of political machinery, that is external affairs ministries and staff, as well as foreign service staff, where there should be more equality. Now, in reality, no country has adopted FFP or some facets of its or some of its facets. No country has accepted all these points. Okay. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Where is your feminist? In fact, I'm going into these countries, so that is why I'm not going into UK, but basically Sweden, Canada, France, and Germany. So next slide. Next slide, please. Now, Sweden, which was the first country to adopt a feminist foreign policy formally in 2014, and the first to retract from it again formally in 2022, had described in its handbook on FFP that it would apply, and I'm quoting, systematic gender equality perspective throughout its foreign policy. In reality, Sweden's FFP was focused only on women and girls as a target group, raising doubts about its intersectionality. The current Swedish Foreign Minister, Tobias Billström, also cited concern that the feminist label had become more important than the actual contents of the policy, and in fact, therefore retracted it. Next, basically, Canada introduced a Feminist International Assistance Policy, FIAP, in 2017, with its Minister of Internal Affairs claiming that its primary objective was to, and I'm quoting, eradicate poverty around the world and build a more peaceful, more inclusive, and more prosperous world. So for Canada, the problem was poverty and the solution was women's empowerment. Ironically, Canada made no budgetary changes to operationalize its Feminist International Assistance policy, while it had, in the same period, increased its defense spending, which goes against the gold standard of FFP. France introduced an international strategy on gender equality in 2018 with the objective, and I'm quoting, to systematically mainstream gender equality and the consideration of its gender issues in France's external action. Its sectoral priorities, in fact, did not were very different from that of Canada's, and included access to social services, including reproductive health, access to decent work, women and girls' access to rights and justice, their protection from all forms of violence, their marginal participation, their meaningful participation in economic, political, and social decision making, as well as peace and security processes. But there is no research that I know of which examines what has actually been done so far by France regarding all these issues. It also takes a stand against social and religious customs and traditions, which France thinks prevents realization of women and girls' human rights, like, for instance, wearing the burqa to school. Now, this may interfere with cultural and religious customs um, and cause a lot of irritation and anger among those, in fact, even women who prefer to wear burqas, okay, and therefore is controversial. Now, there have also been questions regarding Germany's adoption of FFP norms. The issue is whether it is real or whether it is to gain international applause. Germany has an excellent record regarding immigration, but the EU's new pact on migration and asylum, May 2024, which frames migration as a security threat to which Germany is a signatory, raises questions regarding its commitment to human rights because a large number of the migrants to the EU and of course, a large number have entered Germany more than other states. In fact, they come from countries where, in fact, women's rights are not respected, and even human rights are not respected. So, therefore, basically, whether it is a label or whether it is real, it has to be seen because Germany's FFP is quite new. Now, what I'm trying to say is that the concept of FFP, when properly understood in the background of the knowledge provided by feminist IR theory, is almost idealistic and almost utopian in its scope. Next slide, please. So basically, what I said is it's utopian, and in fact, it has moved from gender-centered appraisals, or as such, to in fact intersectional approaches, and in fact broadened it so much that many countries will find it difficult to implement all the aspects that I have mentioned over here. It cannot be expected that any country would adopt a policy that speaks of peace, climate change, gender equality, that is intersectional, a restructured world where there is no feminization of poverty, fully in toto, and follow it, leaving behind its own national interests, which of course is seen in terms of basically power, all right, in a very competitive world, an increasingly competitive world, all right, and where especially the defense industry, because we're talking about economic competition also, the defense industry is the most lucrative industry in the world, all right, as such. Also, defense preparedness is most important, is critical to state survival in a world which is actually increasingly anarchic, as you can see from what is happening in the Middle East and also in Ukraine and the expansion of NATO. Okay, so basically, where are we going? Now, under those circumstances, giving up basically the ideas of security in its traditional form and accepting the ideals of FFP security and peace, or right, may be difficult for countries which follow their own national interests, and national interest involves also national survival. However, all is not lost. FFP continues in many countries, although the most powerful countries, the US, China, and Russia, do not mention it. They do not talk about it, although the US actually has implemented quite a bit of what FFP talks about in terms of development assistance, etc. But then it has not talked about it, has not used the label, put it as such, of FFP. Okay. And in fact, only Mexico and Mongolia from the global south have accepted it, although many Latin American countries have endorsed it and will probably accept it in the future. There is, in this context, something that I must mention, the third ministerial conference on FFP in Mexico in July 2024, this year. And the fourth has been planned next year in Germany. At Mexico, meaningful discussions were held. In fact, in the context of today's talk, I was looking at some of these, and of course, what they're talking about is very, very pertinent. And the fact is that they're talking about it. Well, they will certainly try to do something about it. So there were these many, many panels on feminist sustainable development, feminist financing for development, women, peace and security, climate change, and the role of feminist civil society organizations. Okay. Encouragingly, in fact, 20 UN member states that attended the conference confirmed that they would adopt FFPs and or strengthen gender equality in their foreign policies to comply with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development on achieving gender equality and empowerment of all women, young girls and young women in all their diversity from a gender transformative approach. Now, this is promising for FFP, as is the fact that at least 100 civil society organizations were represented at the conference. Governments with their own security threats, their own security concerns, the security interests, national agendas can only do so much. The goals of a feminist foreign policy can be forwarded by civil society organizations, something, in fact, civil society organizations have done in women in development and other areas where women are involved, okay, women's issues. So far as governments are concerned, it is enough for now that they should follow a gender-sensitive foreign policy and that there should be bipartisan consensus on gender equality and gender and development issues so that the feminist and feminist foreign policy does not become a label to be discarded with a change in government. And this basically happened in Sweden, and it can happen in France, it can happen in many other countries where, in fact, there is a rightward drift in, well, basically, governments. And in fact, one finds that liberal governments are more likely to adopt feminist foreign policies than actually right-wing governments. So therefore, basically a bipartisan or a multi-partisan approach to gender equality is probably more needed than anything else so that, well, FFP can be sustained in its different forms. Last slide is just a thank you. Basically, I hope this has been informative so far, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an insightful session. I mean, it was covering the peace, the gender equality issues and everything, and how the examples from Sweden, Germany, etc., and showing how there are gaps between theory and in practicality. So it was an insightful session. Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I would request Professor Vibhuti Patel to give her remarks on the session.
Thank you, Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya. It is always a treat to listen to you and your whole gamut of issues that you bring out on table. My first question is about what do you think is going to be the current crisis in Gaza and Israel? Because there is tremendous demoralization among the global feminist movement. I remember attending UN conference in 1985. At the moment you start defending Palestinian women or PLO, people would come and even physically hit you. That was the kind of aggression we have personally seen. Even in 2005, the same. But currently, the way it is, whole audiovisual media and social media is whipping up such frenzy, So what do you think about that? And what is your understanding of the Colombian feminist 1,000 women signed petition demanding peace and pacifist feminist foreign policy? Even another utopia. But do you think that it is going to catch, and it is going to become a movement, and women from other countries will also join them.
Thank you, Professor Patel. And these are both very pertinent questions in the context of today's international relations and global politics. Uh, uh, the Middle East actually is, or I should say West Asia from the Indian point of view, is in fact a cauldron. And when we talk about, as I told you, I was reading this article in Foreign Policy about total war. And this was in the context not of Europe, but of the Middle East, all right? So it's basically the very fact, even the fact that countries act in their own interests. The immediate response of India last year, when in fact the attack took place, was basically in support of Israel, all right, and against terrorism. Of course, we are against terrorism and all that. But one must also understand the history of Palestine. Uh, and basically, when you look at the history of Palestine, just see if you were a Palestinian or if this happened to your country. I mean, India itself had gone through colonialism and it has gone through the heartbreak of partition and things like that. Okay, and so there also. In fact, I used to teach all this. I mean, one was 47, one was 48, and the whole thing was kind of engineered, you can say, divide and leave, all right, as such. Doesn't matter what happens afterwards, okay? And the same thing happened if you really look at Sri Lanka. You see this kind of divide and leave. Now, the legacies of that colonialism, colonial divide and rule, divide and leave policy, it continues. And the fact that the major country, now, why do these countries like the United States, etc., support Israel so much? Primarily, there's of course a very rich Israeli lobby. There's also the defense lobby. All right, so Israel is a buyer of American. Now, America cannot afford not to, all right, support, because then whoever is there. I mean, the elections are coming up in the United States; they're going to lose. All right, so this issue of Israel. Now, what is interesting is, of course, and we are talking about when you took up the issue of women in Palestine, you were physically, I mean, I am really shocked, primarily because I think the global south should at least look at Palestinian women and children and the plight that they're going through. Okay. Uh, Very similar to, in fact, I was looking at the issue of Afghan women, all right. Some of them may believe in burqas and things like that, but everybody believes in education, all that kind of thing. So here, Palestinian women are being from 1948, they are being what? Uh, Moved from place to place, from place to place and place. They don't have a future, all right, as such. So under those circumstances, as I said, women are the worst victims of war. Okay, men will face, they are in the war front and they face bullets, they die, they are the ones who create the wars and they fight the wars and all that. But women who do not fight the wars, they are the ones who are the victims of war. Okay, and here the Palestinian women are actually the victims of war. Okay, uh, I don't know whether you read Trojan Women. I think it was, which was the author? Uh, Greek play, not
Yeah.
Aeschylus. Okay,
Lysis
so basically there, I mean, all these women are being taken as slaves, all right? It was a woman, Helen, who launched, well, these 1,000 ships and all that. Okay, but the war that took place is the women who suffered. So it's always the women who suffer, and here Palestinian women are suffering. Now, basically, in fact, I think civil society organizations should take up the cause of these women. In fact, in Israel, the women in black, there was this movement, okay? They, in fact, talked about basically Palestinian women. But you find in the rest of the world, I mean, they are not there. They're so scared. I met in the United States some Palestinian women who are there, and they are scared to speak up about anything, all right, as such. Because why? In America, they're not supported, as you said. In the UN, they're not supported. They are scared. I mean, they're scared to go to mosques and all that, and to kind of say that they're Palestinian. Uh, I was saying, why? Why are you afraid to say that you are Palestinian? This is because there's such a thing about well, the idea of Palestine. So you can't call yourself a Palestinian woman that way. So anyway, I mean, I really think that if there is a total war, all right, as such, it will start there itself. It's not Ukraine, and it's here. Okay, Ukraine Well, Russia, of course, has its own goals and all that, and there you find, of course, the realist foreign policy and all that. But here you find constructivism, the critical theories all coming together, all right, as such. And of course, the worst victims are the women. Okay. Uh, your second question about Colombia, no. In fact, I was looking at the Mexico conference, or it as such, and there, in fact, there was hardly any mention of well, this kind of thing. So I do not think it's going to be taken. What needs to be done, as I said, that it's the civil society organization, the feminist organization, the grassroots feminist organization, which take up issues and which follow it through. Okay, and they are the ones who get things done. But here, in fact, you do not find them taking up, all right, as such. So basically, I do not see a future for the Colombian movement. That's it. I hope that answers your question.
I like you mentioning Trojan horse by your reproduce. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now we will open the floor for Q&A session. Participants, I encourage you to use either the raise hand feature on Zoom to ask your questions live, or you can type your questions into the Q&A box or chat box, and we'll address them here. So we already have 3 questions in the Q&A box. So the first question is from Pinku Jha ji. Can we relate the case of gendered apartheid in Afghanistan, where roots of terrorism could be linked to gender? The second question is, aren't we saying feminist foreign policy is in institutional forms are more or less limit itself to universal category of women? That is, it excludes third gender or colored women, etc.
Okay, can we relate the case of gendered apartheid in Afghanistan, where roots of terrorism could be linked to gender? Yeah, definitely. I mean, in fact, that is what I was talking about. I mean, feminist IR theory talks about roots of terrorism as being linked to gender, and basically the domination or patriarchal domination of Afghan, or rather women, by men. So after, in fact, 9/11, this became an area of study. So we can relate gendered apartheid in Afghanistan. If you're calling it gendered apartheid in Afghanistan, okay, we can call it apartheid, but probably it's apartheid has a definite connotation. So I'd rather use some other word. Uh, uh, and the roots of terrorism, of course, are linked to gender. Now, the other question is, aren't we saying feminist foreign policy in institutional forms are more or less limit itself to universal category of women, excludes third gender or colored? In fact, intersectionalism talks about third gender, colored women, and increasingly, in fact, is, as I said, non-binary and pluralistic. And intersectionalism is becoming the norm of IR theory, and therefore IR theory, which underpins actually FFP. That also is coming in. And if you look at my definition, not my definition, the definition that was given by ICRW, that really is an intersectional analysis of gender. Now, and that is why I said that it's kind of utopian when you talk about all that, but definitely uh, the marginalized others, all right, which is colored women, post-colonial women, queer women, okay, LGBTQIA plus, okay, all this has informed, okay, feminist IR theory. So now, in fact, well, uh, these are being considered when, in fact, FFP is discussed, okay? But as I said, that in a world which is, well, well, what should I say? You can't really categorize the world as, anarchical or whatever it is, because there are institutions, there is international law, there is liberalism, there's constructivism. All these theories can be applied to the international condition, but which is largely, all right, as such, based on national interests and power relations, okay, where still, in fact, competition for power is the driving force of foreign policy, okay. There, in fact, Well, FFP with its intersectionalism, with its basically alternative, all right, which really looks at peace and equality, not just gender equality, but equality for all marginalized, okay? Uh, Constructive dialogues, okay, and is transformative. It wants to transform the world. There, how much place does it have, okay? Uh, and Muhammad Shafiq Sultan, uh, the
Uh,
question is,
Ma'am,
uh,
maybe Mohammed Shafiq Sultan, if he's comfortable asking the question, he can ask you directly.
okay, sure, definitely.
Mohammed Shafiq Sultanji, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hello everyone. My name is Muhammad Shafiq Sultan. I have a question from Professor.
Please introduce
Bhattacharya.
yourself. Yeah, please introduce yourself.
My name is Muhammad Shafiq Sultan. I am from Afghanistan. Currently, I am doing PhD in the University of Delhi. So my question is that um, Sweden's feminist foreign policy is structured on three Rs: rights, representation, and resources. Why did Sweden choose these three Rs?
As I mentioned during my talk, uh, different countries, and that is why I said feminist foreign policies and not feminist foreign policy, because policy would mean just one policy, okay? Policies uh, would be, multiple versions, uh, accepting certain facets, all right, as such, of feminist foreign policy, or rather, based on basically feminist international relations theory and feminism. Uh, Sweden, in fact, uh, focused on the three R's, all right, rights, representation, and resources. And in fact, later on tried to add a fourth one. But more than anything else, it focused on, if you really look at what it did, what did it do for rights? Did it allocate money for it? And how do you basically uh, hold the rights of uh, the marginalized in other countries? Because foreign policy deals with other countries, okay? And now representation, of course, deals with your own country, and you find some of the best representation of women in Sweden. So they focused on that, in fact, balancing the male-female ratio, all right, as such, in Sweden. So that was something that they could do. Uh, and when you talk about resources, it did allocate uh, some amount, all right, as such, but at the same time, what you find is it focused on things that it could do. Okay, so that is why, I mean, countries like, for instance, Canada chose FIAP assistance program, but it did not really allocate all that much for assistance programs. But this is what it found it could do, all right, as such, within its foreign policy. And Sweden probably realized that this is what it could do under the circumstances, and that is why, in fact, it chose these three R's. But whether uh, these three R's were really promoted. There's this handbook on FFP published by Sweden, which really talks about much more that it could do. But if you really look at what it has done, and I haven't seen any, maybe in Swedish there is, but I have not had access to, well, how it conducted between 2014 and 2022, which is actually a very short period. It's FFP based on rights representation and resources as such. But as I said, that there are many feminist foreign policies, and countries choose uh, things that it can do, all right, to push its FFP forward. And here, in fact, Sweden took these three because, especially representation, because this is something that it could do. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Now,
Now I request Muna Khayal Khattakji to ask the question. All right. So the ma'am question is, has any
yeah, I can read it. Global South, has any state from Global South shown any intention to adopt FFP? That's a question.
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, basically, yeah, as I said that Mexico, uh, if you can put it in the global south, it's actually in the intersection between the south and the north. Okay, geographically as well as otherwise too. But it is supposed to be part of the global south. And interestingly, Mongolia, way to the east. Now, these two countries have uh, accepted an FFP. Now, there are other countries which have shown an interest, okay, and these are all from Latin America, uh, in basically adopting at least some facets of FFP or a gender sensitive foreign policy. Now, what is interesting is that Global South includes, and when you really think about the Global South, it's we also think about Africa and South Asia, Southeast Asia. Now, no country of South Asia or Southeast Asia has really talked about FFP. Okay, no country of Africa has talked about FFP. Now, uh, whether the Latin American countries are influenced by uh, European countries or Canada, and they're part of it, or because Mexico has really talked about FFP. And of course, you find that there is, I don't know whether there is more gender equality in Latin American countries, but there are movements, all right, as such, where women play an equal role with men, all right, as such, politically at least, okay, even Argentina and countries like that. In Colombia, there was this 1,000, which Professor Vibhuti Patel was talking about 1,000 women signing a petition. So maybe, in fact, women have influenced Latin American countries into, okay, uh, uh, well, going for at least some facets of gender sensitive foreign policy. But what is interesting is that in Africa, no country, there is a lot of gender inequality if you look at African countries. And in fact, if we go by our IR theory, where countries where basically there is so much of gender inequality, those tend to make war. I mean, I'd say that is one theory. But what I would like to say is that where there is a lot of gender inequality, except for countries which tried to bring about at least equality in representation, for instance, Rwanda, post-conflict Rwanda, okay, 40% representation for women in the Rwandan parliament. Uh, but even there, all right, it's something like, the kind of quotas that we have in our country for women, okay, at the panchayat level or something like that. Do the women actually have the power, or is it actually the men working through the women? So, these are questions which have to come up, all right. So, where there is gender inequality, all right, as such, at the general level, don't think about yourself or I or Professor Vibhuti Patel or anybody like that. All right. Uh, but think about, all right, the woman who comes to work in your house, all right, as such. So basically, India, for instance, is made up largely of women who actually belong to that class. Okay. Who and men also. I mean, why in Calcutta, of all places, where in fact I didn't grow up in Calcutta, in Kolkata, as it is known now. I didn't grow up here, but Kolkata was supposed to be a very safe city for women. Okay, but look what's happened to it now. All right, every day, despite the Arjikor issue, I mean, you are hearing about rape cases and murder cases of minor women, minor girls. All right, so basically, in countries where you cannot change the perspective of men, all right, as such, and that is what, in fact, this entire thing that we're talking about in the Arjikor issue. Already, we want justice. In fact, I have been also marching along with these people. We want justice. We don't want protection. We want equality. We want to feel safe. We don't want to be called Nirbhaya or Abhaya. We want to be ourselves and we want to be safe. Okay. Now that has not happened, and as long as that does not happen in the global south, well, uh, where in fact it's the male politicians who dominate politics. Okay, uh, how many women representatives do we have in parliament? Uh, it's because the political parties, all right, unless they're forced to do so, they do not, in fact, put up women candidates, all right, as such for parliament. Okay, and the kind of women parliamentarians, say, put up by the TMC and all that, they do not have any experience, all right, as such. So what will they do in parliament? Okay, so basically we cannot think in terms of an FFP. Okay, we need an informed women and men, all right, as such, uh, what to cooperate together to bring about a feminist foreign policy over here. Does that help you?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. I request Devjani Chaudhary ji to ask the question.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes,
Good
Yes,
evening
you
to
are.
everyone. Yes, myself Devjani Chaudhary, and I am a scholar at the University of North Bengal pursuing my PhD program here. My question, ma'am, to you is, as you were just mentioning about all these cases that we are having in India, what strategies do you feel can foreign policy employ in order to empower women in developing countries like India itself? Like we might,
Okay.
yes, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, please carry on. We might.
No, like I just want to know, like, what can be, I mean, like you just said, you just mentioned, like our representation, women representation in parliaments and all, it's just a namesake kind of a thing. We really don't have much of empowerment is not happening. And how many of us are truly empowered? Most of us are women. We have maids at home and all. They're really not empowered. So now, what can be an adequate policy for a developing nation, especially a country like India? What do you think can be? And in terms of foreign policy, what can be done?
Right. That's an interesting question because there are two aspects to it. I mean, foreign policy is something to do with, of course, state power and its position in international relations, and basically a whole lot of other things. Or it is state security and all that. Okay, state sovereignty. But when you're talking about women's empowerment, we're talking about women in development, women, gender and development, okay, things like that, which are mainly domestic issues. Now, foreign policies can give assistance, all right, as such, to countries. Uh, for instance, in fact, the United States had the USAID, all right, as such, which also included things like reproductive health, all right, as such. They, in fact, gave us a lot of, I mean, when I was growing up, way back, in fact, I was in school, college, and all that. There were these American young people who used to come and, in fact, go to the villages, etc., and talk about, well, not having too many children, all right, and how to prevent, all right, as such. So basically, a smaller family would be more educated, they would be able to allocate more funds for the growth of the child, etc. Okay, so foreign policy also has this component of foreign assistance, all right, for uh, development. And here you're talking about empowerment of women. Okay, so
Yes.
assistance for, well, the girl child, all right, teaching the girl child, uh, educating, all right. Uh, our country itself has been talking about ladki padhao, uh,
Beti
ladki,
bachao and
yeah,
ladki padhao.
okay. Okay, so padhao, yes, but women are not safe. Okay,
Yes.
so yeah, I mean that is the
Archie,
anomaly
for
over here.
instance, the girl here was highly educated and yet she faced what she faced. So we
Absolutely,
do have,
absolutely, absolutely. And what is this business of calling them Nibhaya and Abhaya? I mean, fine. I mean, but I have this problem with this issue of calling them Nibhaya because we are afraid. We are
right,
afraid, all right, as such, of
right,
going out
right.
in the dark, going out alone at night, or whatever,
Absolutely.
So, uh, so basically, I mean, putting these labels, I mean, it's something very wrong. So,
Yes.
what can be done? What can be done is, all right, in fact, educating the men.
Huh.
This is,
I suppose, yes, instead of the feminist foreign, it should be more a masculine foreign policy. I mean, where we should be actually dealing with the male. Yes, it is they, and it's just not them. I think both the male and the female. But then this, what we are talking about on ground, I don't think this is really becoming practically possible. Because if it is education, also our girls are highly educated, but they are victimized. We
absolutely,
really,
absolutely. So, it is actually the attitude. It's not
yes,
only, I mean,
yes.
the same thing happens, I don't know. I mean, the world is a very complicated place, all right?
Mm,
Women also are responsible to a large extent in passing on, all right, at such stereotypes.
mm.
And so therefore that also has to be changed. There's So when you talk about IR theory being transformative, it's actually deconstructing. So we have to deconstruct femininity as well as masculinity. Okay, not
Right.
masculinity as well as femininity, and both
And
or as
yes.
such, and rebuild on a different basis. Okay, now for instance, women, if given power, all right, as such, how would they behave if they become prime ministers or whatever? Look at, let me give you three examples: Indira Gandhi, Golda
Mm.
Meir, Thatcher. Okay,
Yes.
these were
Yes.
women prime ministers, but they were heads of state, and they took the importance was for them the national interest, okay, and security, and all of them went to war. Okay, so it's not a question of peace. Now, even when if Kamala Harris becomes, all right, the president of the United States, you think
US.
that there'll be any change in defense policy or anything like that? I
No.
don't think so. Okay,
Yes.
so basically, it's the same thing, all right, as such, which is fine. I mean, education is fine, national interest is fine, but for the general public, I mean, things like, for instance, Abu Ghraib. Let me just remind you, there were women there, all right, who were actually, I mean, when it comes to the marginalized other, and here I'm talking about intersectional, all right, the marginalized men in Iraq, all right, as such, who had been defeated in a prison, all right, as such, how do you abuse prisoners? Women basically abusing prisoners. Okay, so basically, as I said, uh, it's a complicated word, and when you're talking about assistance for empowerment, all right, what is empowerment? Okay, the right kind of empowerment is required for women, and as I said, we also need assistance for giving uh, a different kind of education to men, all right, as such, which, all right, which is not based on masculine power, but basically looking at women with an equal lens. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I now request Dr. Keshab Giriji to ask his question.
So sorry, I don't have question. I think it's been already answered, but thank you so much, Professor Bhattacharya, for giving such an extensive overview of feminist foreign policy and then also different politics behind it. I was just wondering when you said more unequal states, such as the states in Africa, are less likely that they would try to get foreign policy under feminist line. I wonder if that was a result of colonial legacy, when often there is a criticism, which I will come back to that later in my presentation, is that there is this gender line, right? It used to be poverty line, and then it used to be a color line. The states were divided between color line and then poverty line, and then is it the gender line? Are people in global South worried that this is another way of this kind of civilizational divide, so that they don't want to name their foreign policy as feminist? And despite agreeing on the principles and an idea that all genders should be equal.
Yes, Dr. Giri, if I can think, if I can understand your question, it is about Africa, and did you talk about basically the gender lines, the color lines, and all that?
Yeah, it's generally all the global South. I was just thinking about the skepticism in global South regarding feminist foreign policy. Yes, there has been a lot of enthusiasm, and particularly lately, the global South countries have taken up the mantle, and then they have gone further to propose very progressive ideas like pacifist foreign policy, like Colombia. But also at the same time, I understand that there are significant reservation, and then I wonder if that was a part of colonial legacy, and then the way there is this clear divide between those who claim themselves to be gender equal and then consider their foreign policy to be feminist, and then those who do not.
Okay. In fact, it's actually you're right about that. I mean, when you mentioned really Colombia, there are other countries in Latin America which will have declared that they're going to accept certain facets at least or of FFP, or they're going to have a gender-sensitive feminist foreign policy. In fact, there's more awareness of feminist foreign policy in Latin American countries than there are in other parts of the global South. Okay. Uh, Basically, even in India, all right, as such, I was just asking somebody offhand, have you ever heard of FFP, a feminist foreign policy? I mean, this was an educated woman, all right. She said, no, you know, only in the academic circles we're talking about a feminist foreign policy. How many laypersons know in India about a feminist foreign policy, or for that matter, in Pakistan or in Bangladesh or well, in the Southeast Asian countries? Okay, so there is a lack of awareness of what it entails, and that is why, in fact, I talked so much about theory today, because even in the academic area, uh, we talk about feminist foreign policy, and we think that basically is meant it's a pro woman thing, it's a pro feminist thing, all right, as such, and the very word feminist may put off some people, all right, as such, some males, all right, as such. But the fact is, it is intersectional, and it really talks about marginalization, it talks about post-colonialism, it talks about, there's a lot of critique on it, all right, as such, which is so relevant to today's world and world peace. Okay. But how many people understand that? Okay. And as you said, that there these Latin American countries, Mexico, for instance, okay, of course, which has adopted an FFP, there seems to be much more awareness of FFP than actually in other parts of the global south, like Africa, where uh, the divide, which is not only just masculine, feminine, which is not just binary. It's also between, there's a big divide, a digital divide. Okay. There's a divide between the rich and the poor, between the urban and the rural. Okay. So here you find where there's so much of divides, all right, as such, which in fact FFP would like to, all right, as such, would attempt to, all right, as such, to okay. Uh, these are there. So you do not find that kind of fascination for feminist foreign policy, especially among the politicians who devise a foreign policy, right? If that would answer your question. In fact, I would like to listen to you after this. And
Just quickly sorry, I don't want to hijack this Q&A, but just quickly want to come back to that. Yes, we cannot expect too much in very short time. It started in 2014. And of course, you highlighted that there have been generations of feminist activism, WPS and CEDAW, and then again, even conventions and so on. But in policy, it is started in 2014, and within a decade, there has been, I think we need to see the progress there. But also there are some African countries like Liberia, Libya, who have declared that they will pursue feminist foreign policy, and then also in the last ministerial conference on feminist foreign policy, a lot of civil society organizations from.
but I would like to interfere, interrupt you here. These countries, they talk about it. As I said, talking about it can bring international applause that all right, you're accepting it. But what is their agenda? All right. If in the domestic field there is so much of inequality, all right, as such, first, in fact, settle your own house, then talk about foreign policy, right? So if there is so much of inequality in Nigeria, okay, if there is so much of, what should I say? I mean, where the terrorists target women and girls, all right, as such, uh, and the state has not been able to solve the problem, all right, as such. So basically, uh, what will it do in foreign policy? So stating that I'm going to accept, I mean, adopt or rather, basically reduce a FFP, uh, it's more like what? A label than anything else, all right? What is the actual content of the policy?
I think you
That's-
are right that level doesn't make much difference, but also it is a political statement. But yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there are different motivations for labeling their foreign policy as feminist.
Yeah, we need a feminist foreign policy. In all its facets, definitely, if we want a more peaceful world. But basically, those countries which have adopted certain facets of it, even Canada, etc., they are also responsible for the global arms trade, for defense industries and all that. And so basically, how can we think about an FFP? We can have, Canada is very clear. They have an international assistance program, a feminist international assistance program. They're not talking about a full-fledged, audit as such, feminist foreign policy. So basically, you can accept some of it and have a gender-sensitive, foreign policy. But a feminist foreign policy, okay? Sweden, in fact, tried to do it, but as it was just based on those 3 Rs, as such. So that is not a a feminist foreign policy in total. Okay. So basically, representation, etc., it's very good. It's the beginning. Okay. But then what happens? The government is overturned. New government comes in, and they retreat from that. They retract the feminist foreign policy. Or they still say that they are gender sensitive and all that, but they said it's more of a label, so you're not going to use the term feminist foreign policy. Now, what have they done? They have increased representation. But so far as the other parts of it, what have they done? More research needs to be done because they retracted only in 2022. And I have not seen much research about what they have done outside, because foreign policy is to do with other countries. Okay. So let's look into that. Okay.
I think you have answered most of the questions in the question box, but one Ms. Simran Napit from Nepal, I think her question is, bringing some new points. Simranji, you can ask. Simran Napit from Nepal, Supreme Court of Nepal. Hello, are you there? Then I think Avni Sablok, you can go ahead.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Due to the shortage of time, we'll forward all the questions that are there in the Q&A box and in the chat box to Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya ji, and we'll forward it to all the participants after she has answered the questions.
She has already
Thank you.
answered most of the questions.
So,
Can I ask a small question?
Yeah, please.
yeah, sure.
Thank you, ma'am, for an informative session. I've learned a lot today. My question is centered around when you come to defining feminist policy. Nowadays, we see that there is people are talking about, like the governments are talking about the terminology, whether they want to use use it as feminist foreign policy, or like in the Indian government says that they want to use the term gender mainstreaming in foreign policy. So how do you think, does it limit, or is it using the term feminist, does it threaten the men? Or are they being very conscious about women in mainstreaming women in every aspect in powerful positions as well? Thank you.
Look, gender mainstreaming is not the same as feminist foreign policy. Gender mainstream is more like what? I mean, equality in representation. But as I said, what kind of representation? Okay. You can put in more women, as such, into foreign policy institutions, the External Affairs Ministry. You can have more ambassadors, women ambassadors. But then, of course, this is not feminist foreign policy. I mean, what is gender mainstreaming? Okay. I really don't understand how this is feminist foreign policy. Okay. Because as I tried to explain what is feminist foreign policy, this gender mainstreaming is not the same thing. Right? We've been trying to do this, all right, by what? Bringing in quotas. Now, do quotas help? I mean, basically, look at the panchayat system. I mean, the women who 30% representation, and for quite a few years, and most of them are what? They are just like puppets in the hands of the male counterparts, who are, just because this is a woman's representative area or data says they cannot compete, but they are the ones who pull the strings. Okay, she's there. In fact, somebody's wife is very much there, and she will do exactly what she's told. So that that is more like, what India thinks in terms of gender mainstreaming, bringing in more women, okay? But bringing in more women does not help really. What kind of women and what kind of policy that you follow, okay? Uh, as I said, but ladki padhao, ladki bachao. Now, ladki padhao is fine, uh, okay, but as I said, that what is required is equality in all aspects, all right, as such, and it's not just ladki. It's third gender is also there. I mean, why not mainstream that too? Okay. So basically, you have to think in terms of a policy which is much more comprehensive than bringing in more women or quotas, which is gender mainstreaming for India. Okay. Does that answer your question, Abhi?
Yes, ma'am, it does. It provides me more clarity on the terminologies that because there was also how the political setup of a country, the changing political setup of the country influences the kind of terms that they use.
Yeah.
So there was also a talk in Sweden in which they were very uncomfortable with using the word feminist, and they also wanted to switch to a word which is more neutral and doesn't threaten marginalizing men instead.
Absolutely,
Or
absolutely. In fact,
represent to out with men concept.
as I said, many are very, very suspicious of the word feminist. And in fact, the new right or the rightist movements in Europe, etc., they're uncomfortable with, definitely uncomfortable with the word feminist, all right, and especially in terms of feminist foreign policy, because as I said, you really need a thorough understanding of feminist IR to understand. I mean, and the trends in feminist IR to understand what is feminist foreign policy. All right, it's not just basically bringing in more women or giving women more assistance for, like having a women's university or something like that. It's not just that. It's it's something beyond women. It's not binary. It's multiple axes that we are bringing in today when you think in terms of feminist foreign policy or feminist IR. Okay, it's not just basically the patriarchal domination of man by woman. All right, it is the domination of the marginalized. All right, as such, women, girls, young women, LGBTQIA plus. Okay, uh, the poor, the migrant workers, okay, immigration is very important. Those were left behind, so that nobody, no woman or no marginalized person is left behind. Clear me?
Thank you, ma'am. And ma'am, I forgot to introduce myself. I am Avni Sablok from Indian Council of World Affairs. Thank you for taking my question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much,
So now
ma'am.
I think we should.
Ma'am, I would request you to answer the questions that are there in the Q&A box by typing the answers, if it is possible for you.
Okay, you want me to do it right now?
I mean, yeah, if it is fine with you, or we will mail you the questions later on.
Please mail me the questions, right?
Fine.
Because I have to be going out shortly.
Yes.
Yeah.
No
Okay.
worries, ma'am. No worries.
Thank you.
Yes.
Please
So,
mail me the questions because I don't think I'll be able to access this later on. So mail me the questions, I will reply,
all
definitely.
right.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So next, I would like to invite Dr. Keshab Giri, lecturer in international relations at University of St. Andrews and research fellow at WAPPP, Howard Kennedy School, for his address on decolonial feminist future. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Fiza, for a kind introduction. And thank you so much, Professor Bhattacharya, for setting the stage for me. You did the heavy lifting. You offer an extensive overview of feminist foreign policy, but also you talked a lot about different feminist theoretical frameworks that inform feminist foreign policy. So are you able to share my slides on the screen there? So, and also I feel extremely privileged to be presenting here in front of feminist luminaries in India, such as Professor Anuradha Chenoy, Professor Vibhuti Patel. It makes me extremely nervous. Let me know if I sound like incoherent. But thank you so much for organizing this wonderful fellowship program.
We'll
Could
just
you
share the slide. Yes, sir. Just give us a moment. We'll just share the slide.
Yeah. So what are you gonna talk about? How much time have I got left, actually?
Go ahead. Take your own 45 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I will talk a little bit about way to decolonial future. So I'm from international relation discipline. So I will talk about the different ways the IR discipline is trying to decolonize from this Eurocentric origin. And then I will talk about feminist foreign policy and global South, how global South has contributed to this feminist foreign policy. And then I will talk about critics of feminist foreign policy. Actually, Professor Bhattacharya has covered a lot of ground on that as well. But then I will also give you my vision for decolonizing feminist foreign policy. In what ways we can decolonize feminist foreign policy. Okay, if slides are ready, if slides are not ready, then I will start with a survey, if that's okay.
Sure, sir. Yes.
While you are fixing slides, I can start with the survey. So can you quickly log into this form? I will share the form with you in the chat box and answer. What do we mean by decolonizing feminist foreign policy in a word or two? So it will give me some idea on what you think, and then I'll try to structure my presentation accordingly. So you can use this QR code, or I have also shared with you the link. You have 2 minutes. There's 2-minute time limit on that. Okay, I can see a few words there, maybe non-exploitative rather than exploitative. Okay, social justice, intersectionality. I can see a lot of intersectionality there. Localization, imperialism, is that non-imperialism? Equal and local, future for women, gender equality, cultural identities, women, okay, great. So I will come back to this later. We will do this later as well, but I can see intersectionality, gender equality, redefining structures, future for women. Okay, intersectionality seems to be the key word there. Context. Great. Let's. I will come back to this later. Can you share the slide if you got them?
Yes, sir. We will. Yes.
Okay. Could you go to the third, maybe after the survey, fourth one? international relation and Eurocentrism. Okay, so I will start with the state of discipline in international relation and how decolonizing is gathering steam. So there are three ways we see Eurocentrism embedded into international relation, the discipline of international relation. The first one is superiority. I will start with what is the Eurocentrism, and then we will talk about what are the ways the IR is trying to decolonize itself, and then go to feminist foreign policy and how do we decolonize feminist foreign policy. So the first one is the view of Europe as a supreme force in the world history, to view Europe as a prima inter pares, that means first among equals. There are three avatars of superiority if we take into account what Meera Sabaratnam, John Hobson, and also there are different others like Gurminder Bhamra and others have written about. The first one is cultural superiority, which means Europe at the center of civilization and culture. The most famous Can you hear me well?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, the most famous cultural avatar is probably Orientalism, which according to Edward Said is a framing of Orient or East through negative and feminized stereotypes of its culture, political character, social norms, or economic agency. The previous one, please. This framing casts Orient as a space of tradition, an opportunity to be governed and explored, or alternatively feared by the rational and enlightened West. The second avatar is historical avatar. That is the assumption that Europe is a principal subject of world history, as discussed by the Subaltern Studies Research Group, and also by Gayatri Chakrabarti. This is the tendency of historians to see the emergence of capitalism, industrialization, and the beginning of the modern international system in the West as the real driver of history, and the non-Western societies as either falling outside the history or lagging behind Western historical development. So the one manifestation of this is, The End of History by Francis Fukuyama, which says that Western liberal order triumphed over socialist communist political system, but also other political systems outside these two political systems. And finally, we can identify Eurocentrism's epistemic avatar, which is predicated on the temporal and universalism of modern social scientific knowledge. In this tendency, social scientific modes of knowledge, which emerged in Europe from 19th century onwards, are represented as supremely privileged in their understanding of social phenomenon above other modes of knowing, as demonstrated through their powers of abstraction, reasoning, and objectivity. John Hobson argues that Eurocentrism reveals itself often in speaking of European experiences as if they were universal experiences, in granting agency to European actors and denying it to all others, representing historical phenomenon as the unfolding of a purely European logic with no reciprocal output from the East or the rest of the world. The other side of the argument, as propounded by Gurminder Bhamra in 2010 in her article Historical Sociology, International Relation and Connected Histories, is the indigeneity as a major element in the history of rise of Europe. The idea that European development was self-generating. It did not have to borrow from other civilizations. It was driven by war, competition, and enlightenment and technological advances, and that diffused out to the rest of the world through imperial expansion, which Europeans called as civilizing mission. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to get into the controversy of pronunciation, but I'm just clarifying, right? So I mentioned earlier about different lines, right? The first line is a global color line that Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois called the problem of 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea. And you can see that in the pioneer journal of international relation, which was previously called, which is now called as Foreign Affairs, and which was previously called as the Journal of Race Development, and it is associated with different ideology in the West, particularly phrenology, that argued that we can find the superiority of Aryan race by studying the skull structure, facial structure of the people, and they went out to different parts of Asia, Africa to study them. So Aya as a discipline has this kind of a racial and colonial past. The next slide, please. Next slide, please. So how do we decolonize international relation? And there are two, we need to first understand the historical and geographical context of the knowledge. And there are two words that I usually use to understand that. One is abstraction and contrapuntality. So abstraction means any kind of knowledge production is basically an exercise of abstraction. That means you hide certain elements of reality and you present certain elements of reality. So you cannot, there is unlimited, infinite reality. And then you have to be analytical and think about which reality you present. So it is like an iceberg. So the knowledge you present is also based on simultaneous silencing of invisibilizing of other reality. But this knowledge production is always imbricated in power relation. That means power always imposes its interpretation on knowledge. So we can see that the European ideas being hegemonic, not because of on their own, but because of the imperial power, the material power that they had, also imposed interpretation of what it is. Another idea is contrapuntality. It came out of Edward Said's 1993 book, and he talks about contrapuntality comes from actually the music. That means different themes coming together. But he uses contrapuntality as an idea to understand Jane Austen's Mansfield Park novel in 1804. And Jane Austen talks about this kind of great mansion, this estate, and that drives her narrative sensibility and narrative possibility. But that estate itself, the mansion itself, was built on the basis of slavery in Guyana. The Bertram family who owned that castle, they derived their wealth from slavery. And it's quite relevant that just a few days ago in Commonwealth meeting, there were voices on reparation, particularly from Caribbean countries, that they owe $18 trillion Great Britain pound, GB pound. But that part, that slavery part, is left out of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. So it means we need to understand what is hidden there, right? So if we do that, if we understand history and history based on what is silenced there, what is erased there, then we would understand, and then we will decolonize the narrative. And that applies to international relation, is that. And that is also related to who is taken seriously in the discipline of international relation or any cognate discipline. Whose ideas matter? What is the mechanism of validation of knowledge? Robbie Silliam, in his book Decolonizing Politics, argues that those who occupy the margins are not powerless. Rather, marginal positions might afford a deeper understanding of politics that cannot be provided by mainstream approaches. But it is not enough just to having this critical lens to map out silences, erasure, and amnesias, and to produce counter-hegemonic knowledge. The knowledge we produce has to be transformative. It should liberate people from oppression and silences and promote justice and healing. So this is the normative, emancipatory ideals of decolonial knowledge. Next slide, please. So how do we understand, how do we decolonize the history of feminist campaign, feminist movement? So actually, the Professor Bhattacharya also mentioned this. The history of feminist foreign policy goes back centuries before, particularly in 1919, when there was Hague Women's Peace Conference in Hague, and that's where a lot of ideas of feminist foreign policy came about. And there were 1,500 women from 12 nations, but all those 12 nations, they were European nations like the United States, Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, Italy, Hungary, Germany, Denmark, Canada, Belgium, Austria, and Great Britain. Most of the countries at that time, including India, they were colonies of European countries. But next slide, please. But despite that, some of the ideas they proposed were quite revolutionary. They proposed 20 resolutions, and they problematized the idea of masculinist protection. That means war, although which is considered to protect women, war are ways to protect women and children, but that do not actually protect women. That's what Professor Bhattacharya also discussed in terms of women in Palestine. They demanded negotiation for just peace, and which is quite relevant today. There is war going on, but no one talks about negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. The idea of negotiations means kowtowing to Russian imperialism. And also, although the Western ideas of liberalism is predicated on dialogue, that seems to be rare these days. An inclusion of women in peace process to end war, end of military-industrial complex, and they also demanded suffragette. At that time, only 2 countries in the world who offer suffragette. They were New Zealand and Western Australia. Okay, next slide, please. But how do we decolonize, right? How do we make this feminist struggle common? And I think which is really important in terms of, we also discussed that just before, when we think of feminist foreign policy, adding this label means that Western importation is not something indigenous. But we need to deep reflect on our own history, dig into our own history to say that the ideas that now we consider to be revolutionary were there in our part of the world. I'm talking here, but just giving you one example of Yogmaya Nupani in Nepal. She is the first Nepali feminist. And she didn't have chance to get education. She was illiterate. She couldn't read and write. But she led this feminist movement, anti-caste, anti-class social movement in Depression years, between First World War and Second World War. And she didn't just talk about women's rights, but she was also talking about caste system, class system, corruption, and brutality of Rana regime. The Rana regime, in cahoots with British in India, they were oppressing its own people. A lot of extrajudicial killing, oppression. They didn't care about people there. She also broke different conventions, married 3 times to go against patriarchal culture. And she, time and again, she went to Rana regime and to tell them to reform, to change their ways of ruling people, not to oppress people. She went there 3 times, but every time she demanded those changes, they all fell into deaf ears. But in 1941, she first threatened with Agni Samadhi. That means more than 200 of her disciples and herself. They said that if they don't agree with her demands, then they will self-immolate. They will do Agni Samadhi. And then Rana regime, they disrupted that. But later, in 1941, she, along with her 68 disciples, they threw themselves into the river and they committed this mass suicide. And she said, may the unjust Rana government be destroyed. May Dharma be established. But it is quite surprising that her story was suppressed by the democratic regime that came after the fall of Rana regime, and also panchayat system in Nepal. It was only in early 2000, maybe because of the Maoist insurgency in Nepal, when a lot of women, they participated, and then also people started researching on how come women participate in such a large number in a patriarchal society like Nepal, and they started to unearth the history, and then they learn about Yugmaya Nirpane. Unfortunately, that was not by a Nepalese scholar. It was the scholars who were from abroad. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we have to also understand the contribution of Global South in promotion of women's rights. Hansa Mehta, as we might be aware, was the Indian delegate to United Nations Human Rights Commission. She played a significant role in ensuring Article 1 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights to make it more inclusive. And she changed the phrase, all men are born free and equal, to all human beings are born free and equal. And that is quite revolutionary, right? Just to think about the implication of if we had all men are born free and equal in UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that would have erased half of the population. And also, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, Hansa Mehta ensured marriage equality to women through Article 16 of UDHR. Then there is another feminist activist from India. Her name is Sarifa Hamid Ali, who represented India as one of the 15 women in the first UN Commission on the Status of Women in 1946. She drafted the principles of that guide commission in its work to this date. And also she was the president of All India Women's Conference in 1935. Like Hansa Mehta, she also advocated for a greater inclusive language in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I mean, you can just think about that. She was well educated and she could speak 5 different languages, including English and French. And when we think about this global movement for women's right and equality and justice, we don't talk about these women. Maybe Hansa Mehta lately, but it's about this decolonizing the narrative, right? That the global South, non-West is a place where we need to change, and they need to have gender equality when people from women from that part of the world have contributed significantly. And also human security, as Professor Bhattacharya and also inaugural keynote speaker, Dr. Stephenie Foster also mentioned that human security is a key element of feminist foreign policy, which is a major departure from understanding of security as national security, which is mostly in terms of armed weapons, military, and so on. This idea of human security came from Global South. Mehboob ul Haq from Pakistan, he proposed a concept of human development, and that Amartya Sen from India further developed into idea of human security, which includes different, I mean, it's different expansive understanding of security, including economic security, health security, food security, environmental security, personal security, community security, and political security. Next slide, please. I won't go in detail because Dr. Foster and Professor Bhattacharya have already covered into that. You can see that UN World Conferences on Women, they had significant input from Global South women as well, from Mexico City to Copenhagen to Nairobi and Beijing. Next slide, please. Again, I won't go in detail, but just want to highlight that there are many areas of critical concern that Beijing Platform for Action highlighted, which included violence, education, health, employment, political participation, unpaid care work, decision-making, climate change, social norm, poverty, workplace discrimination, food insecurity, which also constitute key ideas of feminist foreign policy, which goes beyond security as national security and tries to incorporate human security. Next slide, please. The adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which is also known as Women, Peace and Security Agenda, was a historic moment for guaranteeing women's right and women's participation in peace process, from negotiation, peace agreement, peacekeeping to post-conflict peace building. Next slide, please. There are 10 different UN Security Council resolutions, which include various provisions from participation of women in all aspects of peace process to protection of women and children from sexual violence in armed conflict, establishing monitoring and accountability mechanism to do this, inclusion of women's civil society organization in peace process, and many more. Next, please. So I will just highlight some of the critiques of women, peace and security agenda. First is the dominance of liberal feminist ideas. It is not intersectional. It does not have much critical space for critical feminist. Next slide, please. It promotes essentialist idea that women are victim, vulnerable, and need to be protected. Again, this masculinist protection logic. And similarly, it promotes the idea that women equals to peace. Next, please. rather than dismantling the patriarchal and military institutions that cause and perpetuate war, Women, Peace and Security agenda focuses on making war safe for women or making military accessible to them, accessible for women. We can come back to this later. There's a lot of different ideas on that, but I'll just quickly run through this, and then later we can discuss that in detail in Q&A. Next slide, please. As I said before, it lacks intersectional lens. Moreover, the Women, Peace and Security agenda presumes that the women in the West have already achieved gender equality, and the rest of the world need to catch up or follow their lead. And I can come back to this later with the developments in USA and Western Europe and what's happening here, and then I can give you the sense that the fight for gender equality is not linear. And next, please. The Women, Peace and Security agenda, UN Security Council resolutions, also reveal contradiction within the West itself, particularly the rise of far-right and conservative forces that seek to threaten the gains of feminists that have been achieved over the generations. Now, next slide, please. So the feminist foreign policy actually was built on all those foundations that I talked about: Women, Peace and Security agenda, basic platform for action, women's movement over the past century. But there have been, and it started in 2014 with Sweden declaring that its foreign policy will be feminist foreign policy, although Sweden has again retracted from that and then said that we want to use feminist in foreign policy. But there have been, although there have been a lot of achievement that has brought gender into central focus of feminist foreign policy. But since I'm focusing on more kind of critical aspect and more kind of decolonizing narrative, I will focus on some of the critiques of feminist foreign policy. Are we pink-washing or rainbow washing or doing more harm than good to the feminist cause of dismantling patriarchy and discriminatory structures of power by saying that we are adopting feminist foreign policy? And that also motivates me to go back to earlier feminist work that already foresaw this kind of direction that we are heading towards. So focusing on contemporary France, Italy, and Netherlands, Sarah Favis, in her book, In the Name of Women's Rights, The Rise of Femonationalism, defines femonationalism as the exploitation and co-optation of feminist themes by anti-Islam and xenophobic campaigns. She shows that by characterizing Muslim males as dangerous to Western societies and as oppressors of women, and by emphasizing need to rescue Muslim and migrant women, these groups use gender equality to justify their racist rhetoric and policies. Similarly, Jaspreet Puar, in her book Terrorist Assemblies, Homonationalism in Queer Times, examines how liberal politics incorporate certain queer subjects into the fold of nation-state, shifting queers from their construction as figures of death to subjects tied to the ideas of life and productivity. This tenuous inclusion of some queer subjects depends, however, on the production of populations of orientalized terrorist bodies. Heteronormative ideologies that the US nation-state has long relied on are now accompanied by what Puar calls homonationalism, a fusing of homosexuality to US pro-war, pro-imperialist agendas. one manifestation of that is, when Israeli Defense Force started bombing Hamas, then there was argument. Why do you support a terrorist who throw homosexuals from top of the roof? They deserve to be demolished. They deserve to be attacked, and all that. So we can see the deployment of this feminist lingo, queer lingo, to justify the racist and colonial policies of occupation and invasion. So that brings to the question, is it new imperialism that is focused on strategic national interest? Is foreign policy a new imperialism, which focuses on national strategic national interest, that advocates women in military, women in intelligence services, and women in foreign services uncritically? We have seen, again, feminist lingo deployed in invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. Feminist foreign policies are a tool that maintain global hierarchies due to their colonial underpinnings and universalism. A transformative project should consider the needs and proposals for a wider variety of actors, creating a world based on pluriversality instead of cosmopolitan Western ideals. And there is this risk, right? As I mentioned earlier, the feminist foreign policies could become a new standard of civilization, claiming that the inclusion of women in democracy, in diplomacy and foreign policy represents a common behavior of advanced countries. Does this constitute a gender line in world politics? I ask. And there are a lot of contradictions that Bhattacharya also mentioned, the arms export, right? Sweden, who is the first state to proclaim a feminist foreign policy, although they retracted from that. They are also the major arm exporters. In fact, all the Western nations who claim to have feminist foreign policy, they heavily export arms, the exporting of death and destruction. And also, there's another scholar that comes to my mind, Rafia Zakaria, American Pakistani feminist scholar. She talks about global aid industry and philanthropy that is aimed at helping and rescuing helpless, poverty and disease-stricken people in global South, and yet the board of this white savior aid industrial complex have 98% people as white, only 2% people of color. So there's a lot of contradiction and criticism coming to feminist foreign policy. Next slide, please. Then how do we decolonize feminist foreign policy in the global South? This is my vision, right? The inclusion and diversity should not be head count, right? It has to be substantive. And Professor Bhattacharya succinctly put that forward just before me. Let's not reduce it to more women in foreign policy and diplomacy. To be sure, this is an important and essential first step, but it is not the end point. The purpose of feminist activism itself, that its goal is to transform oppressive structures rather than advocating for women to hold oppressive power. Just to give you one example, in 2019, top 4 weapon system manufacturer CEOs were women. That has now come down to 2. For example, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, these are the top weapon manufacturer. They have women as CEOs. Does that mean women's empowerment? Does that mean inclusion of women immediately brings gender equality and transform the system? Second, authenticity. I think that was extensively discussed in the inaugural session of this fellowship. The idea that this feminist foreign policy is endogenous to West is beginning to shatter as more and more global South countries have taken up the mantle, and they have provided a progressive way forward, informed by their history of political struggle and crisis. And Mexico is one example, Colombia is one example, Colombia is another example. Similarly, Liberia, Libya, Mongolia is considering feminist foreign policy and so on. So when global North countries are withdrawing or not sure about what to do with feminist foreign policy, global South countries, many of them, they have taken up the mantle. And the context-specific nature of feminist foreign policy, the tenets of feminist foreign policy has to be determined by its own unique history and socioeconomic and political environment. It has to be informed by its own unique vulnerabilities and security concerns. For example, we discussed, right, a Pacific feminist foreign policy by Colombia. It was based on their own experience of decades-long bloody war. And they said that enough is enough. We want to have a Pacific, we want to live in peace and tranquility. We have had enough of it. So it has to come within itself. It doesn't have to be imposed by what anybody else is doing. For example, I can talk about Nepal. Migration and climate change are real security issues, which also intensify existing power relations. So we can focus on that. If there is a discussion in Nepal regarding feminist foreign policy, we had a conference, and also I can see in policy circle, there is a lot of discussion going on there. Fourth one, if we begin to see peace in quantity rather than in quality, it will always result in short-term and reinforce the paramountcy of hardcore national security. So it takes a lot to recover, undo, and heal from damage done to the colonies by the colonizers after centuries of colonialism and patriarchy. The intersection of race, colonialism, and patriarchy means a radical envisioning of feminist foreign policy towards gender equality, demilitarization, and justice. And it takes a long time. We cannot quantify that in terms of number of women in cabinet, number of women in foreign service, and so on. Cynthia Enloe, a feminist theorist and writer, coined the phrase patriarchal time zone of later to describe how gender issues are often pushed aside in crisis decision making. So gender issue is not standalone, right? It always intersects with class, caste, race, and so on. Finally, Audre Lorde, a prominent Black feminist thinker and activist, once said that the struggle for equality, dignity, and justice is not a single issue, because we don't live in a single issue life. To consider feminist foreign policy along these lines implies viewing the world as an expanded community arising from ethical obligation to care for all human beings, placing human beings and nature on an equal footing. So it's not only about human beings, it is also about nature, ecosystem. And I put this picture of people tree because to me, that symbolizes the concern we have for nature. We see nature as it's a person, right? As it's another being. And that is crucial to understanding feminist foreign policy. It is not just, it is so broad. So the understanding of security is multi-issue, right? There are a lot of structures of power connected, and we cannot think security as a single issue. It is not only about gender. It is also about race. It is also about climate. It is also about how do we see other fellow human beings. So we need to look everything in totality, in a holistic way, if we are to move towards equality, justice, and peace. I think that's all I have. Lastly, I would like to engage you to another survey, since you have these two presentations. I want you to gauge your understanding. So can I share my screen? So next slide, please. And then I will share my screen. Actually, you don't need to. I will share my screen. So now, could you, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
So I will copy the link and send it to your chat box. And could you enter, what do you mean by feminist foreign policy now? Do you write that in 1 or 2 words? I'm just trying to share the live feed of that survey, but I don't know why I'm unable to do that. Yeah, now I should be able to do this. Yeah. It's interesting. I can see subversive. That means subverting, I'm guessing that is subverting existing unequal structure. Maybe equality seems to be the central theme now, but also empowerment and equality, mutual respect, transnational solidarity, justice, equality. Okay, great. Yeah, there seems to be some similarity, but also there are differences. So intersectionality, decolonial summary of the earlier survey. I don't see that here, although I see intersectionality there. But there is one qualifier there, liberated intersectionality. Yeah, I would appreciate if you could clarify that later. Maybe we can come back to that later. But that's all. I was just interested in what you had in terms of preconception of decolonial feminist future, and also now you had some lectures on that. What do you mean by decolonial feminist future? I think that's all. I would end up there. Thank you so much for being so patient with my presentation, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, sir. It was an insightful session, and especially the concepts of femo-nationalism and homo-nationalism were the most thought-provoking for me. And now I would like to invite Professor Patel for her remarks.
Yes, Dr. Keshab Giri, it was really a very important insight that we got into the international relations. My two questions are that, see, decolonization lingo is used by the right-wing and cultural nationalists in South Asia, as well as in so many Asian countries. Even dictators are using it, no? Like Filipino feminists are saying that in the name of decolonization, so many things, the most autocratic policies and practices are imposed. So what do you have to say about that? And the whole old debate about cultural relativism versus universal human right, which emerged in the 80s and 90s regarding this very discriminatory family laws or female genital mutilation or some of the barbaric practices that different nations had. What thumb rule should we follow?
Do you want me to come back to this? No? Okay, great. That's a great question. Yeah, it's always decolonizing always comes with it's a double-edged sword. So it can be deployed by nationalist autocratic regime to protect their power, right? To ensure that their regime is secure. But at the same time, when we say decolonizing, I mean, it is thinking about putting decolonizing process in context. So whenever we say that, okay, rest of the world, global South, you need to catch up. You need to do more on ensuring gender equality. That doesn't mean that the global South doesn't have anything meaningful to contribute to. It's not a one-way traffic, especially as I discussed earlier, global South has also contributed a lot. In fact, a lot of human rights discussion in 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they were spearheaded by countries in global South, including India, Pakistan, as well as Latin American countries, African countries. Responsibility to protect, it came from Africa. So it means this kind of having this consciousness, not to lose this kind of authenticity. And then also it also helps us to counter the ideas that human rights, gender equality are, Western import, when in fact, we have also been struggling for that. And that also highlights this universality of these kind of ideas. Some of the rights are really, everyone is contributing to that. And that helps us to take the ownership of these ideas rather than dismissing them as foreign ideas. That's one thing, but there is a real danger of deploying this by power mongers, power-hungry people and elites to perpetuate their own power. I don't have definite answer on how do we draw the line in between. But I guess as long as we as citizen, as informed citizen, are conscious, if the feminist movement is robust, is led by civil society independently, then we can always push back those tendencies in both in global North and global South.
All right.
I
Thank you.
answered the question, but I'm happy to engage if that raises further questions.
I think we have to recreate the experiences of the 70s, solidarity with the Vietnam War and the global solidarity that we watched. That kind of thing, history has to repeat itself.
Yeah, I'm sure because you have long experience in feminist movement and you would definitely know that.
Thank you. I think this is a very, very optimistic note with which, yeah. That is it. There are a couple of questions for you.
Yes, ma'am.
Tinku Jha.
Tinku Jhaji, you can unmute yourself.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, good evening, sir. So thank you so much, sir, for your lecture. So I'm just confused a bit. My question is, don't you think we have moved beyond Eurocentric hegemony? And since we are talking about the Eurocentrism since in this lecture, actually, so nowadays it is not just European countries, but even this American hegemony is very much visible. And not just American hegemony, even within global South, it may have possibility that some nations do wish to occupy the hegemonic position. In that particular power struggle, where do we see that feminist concerns are being heard, or don't you think it is backseated nowadays? So, what can be the possibility to deal with this issue?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Mr. Jha. I mean, whenever we think of imperialism or hegemony, it does not operate on a vacuum. And there are always, you will find, global north in global south and global south in global north. That means there will always be marginalized people in global north and, for example, migrant refugees, and also the people within global north. And in global south, you will always find elite who are well connected, globalized, and who has inordinate amount of power and influence. So I agree with your premise that only thinking Eurocentrism doesn't help much. We need to have this kind of critical understanding of how power operates. But also, when you said American hegemony, I think Eurocentrism also refers to North American dominance. So the ideas that came out of Europe, but also which means that Eurocentrism is also within us, within me as well. Means because I'm educated in Western university and also education system in my own country in Nepal, to greater extent was Eurocentric. I mean, we were talking about World War I and World War II, but we were not familiar with the hardship and war crimes and crime against humanity unfolding in our own border. We didn't know that. I didn't know about Yogmaya Nupani while I was reading about Betty Friedan and other Western feminist scholars. So Eurocentrism was in our institutions, right? This is quite subtle in the ways that the Eurocentrism travels. So that means a close retrospection of ourselves and just trying to unlearn. It means in many cases, unlearning the knowledge that we have learned. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. It makes sense, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Now I request Simran Napitji to unmute herself and ask the question. Simranji. So the question is, what are the risks of imposing Western feminist framework? All right. Simranji, you can ask yourself.
Okay, thank you so much. Namaskar, sir. Dr. Keshab, it was really insightful session from you. And actually, while going through the presentation you have delivered, I actually wanted to ask you a question. And that is like, so you see, like in this modern era, many Western feminists that's flourishing, and that's definitely influencing the global South policies as well. So I'd like to keep it very short, as like my question to you is, what are the risks of imposing Western feminist frameworks on global South policies? And another perspective is like, how can this decolonial approach that you have discussed throughout your presentation, so how could this approach can address this situation? Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Simran, for that very deep question. It doesn't. I would like to clarify here. I don't mean that the Western ideas are always harmful, and we shouldn't think about them, or we shouldn't think of adopting them in our own context. Some of the ideas, as Professor Patel also just mentioned, are universal, right? They are universal, but they can be localized in different ways so that they suit into the context, social, political, cultural context of the society where that ideas or any models are to be employed. So, I mean, there are creative ways and constructive ways that we can learn from others. That doesn't mean that we have to be blind, we have to reject everything and cancel everything that is coming out of the West. Of course, we do appreciate the different ways Western ideas have influenced us, and then promoted the understanding of human society, as well as help us towards justice and peace. What I mean to say is that we have to be really critical. We cannot uncritically adopt ideas in wholesale. So that's one thing. When I say decolonizing, I mean looking back to our own history, our context. There might be many ideas which resonate with the ideas that now we see in the West. So what that does is it generates that legitimacy, that organically we are talking about the ideas, and that then we can take the ownership of these ideas, ownership of those models, which results in greater efficacy of the ideas or policies. So what I'm really saying is that don't do like wholesale importation. Think critically. And then it may be the case that we already have those ideas. We need to do a deep reflection on ourselves.
All right, thank you, sir. Now I request Praveen Rajji to ask his question.
Thank you. So my question is, Dr. Keshab, when do you say the decolonial feminist future? When do you expect this future to come? I mean, are we witnessing some part of those future in the countries where feminist foreign policy has been adopted, or is it just a future that we may never witness across the globe? In fact, given the current fragile geopolitical environment that we are living in, where the rogue actors they tend to somewhere undermine the very credibility of the initiative which is being taken by some parts of the country, be it Iran, be it Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East entire, and then in global the other part of country where North Korea. So how do you see this both going in your understanding of this feminist future?
I'm an optimistic person. I'm really hopeful. And we don't have to wait long for this decolonial future. We actually already, we are already discussing this. We are already practicing this. I mean, just think about environmental degradation. And we are already saying the indigenous ways of living, ways of conserving environment is found to be the best way to respond to this impending climate crisis, right? Previously, the Enlightenment idea means, the modernity means we need to tame the nature, we need to exploit the nature, and we need to make nature, so we need to control the nature and then make it serve human interest. We are now understanding, thanks to decolonial indigenous understanding of the relationship between human and better than human beings, we already know that this is the sustainable way, this is the way forward, this is the way to heal the earth, heal the planet. I mean, just to give you one example is using, leaves for, instead of using plastic, using leaves, the plates made of leaves. I mean, that was used to be something we never thought of, right? But the forefathers, the indigenous people living in our part of the world and elsewhere, they were already living in harmony with nature, with minimal footprint. So we are already adopting those ways of respecting nature and living with nature in harmony. So that's just one example. And also there are, like I said, in feminist strand also, in terms of Nepal, there's a greater push towards learning more about women and their contribution to the politics, to the society, to the culture in the past, I think, which also helps us bring us this dignity to our life. Right now we are, when I was growing up, we always used to think that anything that comes out of the West is best. We try to emulate it. But now we are saying that we are thinking, thanks to the decolonial thinking in academia and beyond, we are saying that we are also, we have also our way of living, ontology and epistemology, which are also worth considering, which are also relevant and which are really useful to deal with the different crises that we are facing today. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, for example, which is embedded and also Panchashila, which is the foreign policy of India, Nepal, and many other countries. We are saying that that is best way forward in the world that is besieged by one after another different crises, and then also this threat of nuclear war. What if we, for a moment, consider the Panchashila and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam seriously? That is a decolonial thinking. Not just thinking, that is a decolonial praxis.
Sure, sir. Thank you for your input.
Now I would request Aditi ji to unmute herself and ask the question.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So my question is that we have, I've read in several papers as well when we critique on the WPS security agenda, starting with UNSCR 1325 resolution. There is a critique that it still engenders colonial thought process. Can you kindly elaborate on it, given that around 100 plus countries have adopted the resolution and we have many global south countries in it who have faced colonialism or imperialism in their previous history. So can you elaborate and explain how does it engender colonial thought process?
Well, that's another deep and relevant question. So yeah, I agree with your the contradiction inherent in your question, right? On the one hand, we have more and more than 100 states adopting women, peace, and security agenda, but on the other hand, we are saying that this is another colonial thinking. This is colonial in the way that it predicates the problems in global South rather than thinking that there are also different problems in the global North itself. A lot of national action plan, that means this is the vehicle through which women, peace, and security agenda is implemented at a local level. If you look at national action plan of global North countries like UK, Australia, Norway, Sweden, and things like that, it is outward focus. That means they seek to promote gender equality outside their country, which means we have achieved gender equality. Now it's the global South who needs to catch up, who need to do their part in gender equality. Yes, that doesn't mean that global South doesn't have any problem. There are a lot of problems. There are different problems specific to global South. And these problems are not just gender, or not just under gender line. They are intersected with race, class, ethnicity, and so on. So what does that mean? It dismisses any problem in the global North. For example, in Italy, in Poland, in United States, there is this anti-abortionist movement, right? So there is, in some states in the United States, they have banned abortion. You cannot abort there. So there is a rollback of the gains made by feminist activists over generations. Now, right-wing forces in Western Europe, including North America, they are talking about natural gender order. That means women should stay at home and look after their children. So when we think that WPS means only global South countries, they have to do their part, it completely erases the problems in global North itself. So in that sense, it is colonial, in a sense that it assumes problem lies outside the border of Europe or Western state. But that doesn't mean that global South doesn't have any problem, but rather I would say that the problem has to be faced by dialogical understanding, the dialogue between global South and global North countries, rather than presuming that everything is all is well in their part and then problem lies somewhere else.
Thank you, sir. So I now request Taiba Atikji to ask the question. Taiba Atikji. So the question is, what could be the best or maybe pragmatic approach for implementation of FFP in global South? And the second question is, in a context of cultural differences between global North and South. I mean, it is continuation to the question itself. Pragmatic approach for implementation of FFP in global South in context of cultural differences between global North and South.
Yeah, like I said earlier, tenets of feminist foreign policy has to be determined by the unique history, socioeconomic and political environment in the state that is seeking to adopt feminist foreign policy. it has to be informed by its own unique vulnerability and security concerns. I gave you example, right, of Nepal. Nepal is in the midst of climate crisis. The flood, the extreme flood, extreme weather pattern has become more regular, and the Himalaya is melting. That will have catastrophic impact on security of not just Nepal, but also Indian subcontinent. So we need to think about that, right? It has so, but if you look at foreign policy of Nepal, it pays very little attention to that security, because the understanding of foreign policy is shaped by the Westphalian understanding of state sovereignty, border security. The more arms and army, the more secure you are, and things like that. And it does not prepare states for the impending climate crisis. And I'm just giving one example there. So different states, they have taken different approaches to implementing their feminist foreign policy, which can be confusing. But at the same time, this is the way to go forward. You cannot just impose your own ideas on others. Yes, you can learn. There are some core pillars, as Stephenie Foster, Dr. Stephenie Foster and Professor Bhattacharya has highlighted succinctly. For example, human security, diversity and inclusion, things like that, right? These are common threads, but also that does not mean that there would be room for creativity and innovation on the part of the state that is trying to adopt feminist foreign policy in their in their country. So it has to be context specific in summary.
All right, thank you, sir. Now I request Parvez Babulji to unmute himself and ask the question. Parvez Babulji. Sir, the question is, I would like to know more about the person of Nepal who worked outstanding for women's right and empowerment.
I mean, there are many who have been working in this space. I don't want to name few of them.
All right. So, Sir Parvez Babulji.
Yeah. I am here. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Keshab and Dr. Sanjukta, both of you. And hearty congratulations for your insightful presentations. And personally, I have been very enriched for your, insightful and very informative presentations. So I was wondered to know about the person of Nepal, that even being an illiterate person, he worked tremendously for the rights of women and the empowerment of women. So may I know more about that, noble person, so that I can follow him?
No, it's woman. I have shared my slides with IMPRI, so I hope they will share slides with you. And in the slide, you will find references as well. So where I got all those references. So in the notes section, you will find references there. So you can find more about them. You can read more about them from that sources.
Okay, thank you so much. And another question is, as I have been working for the women's empowerment, gender issues, and I have been working also for about the climate change and women and migration, etc. And even from Nepal, I got several times media fellowship from the ICMOD, International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. So, and I have visited Nepal also. So I was very interested to know about the issues that how can we make awareness among men and women to establish, and to work more with more strength than that? How can we establish a feminist foreign policy in Bangladesh, especially in South Asian countries also? Please advise.
I mean, I
Because
cannot.
because making awareness is a vital issue, you know.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's an interesting question, but I would defer it to the people, feminist scholars, activists in Bangladesh to determine what kind of feminist foreign policy that you want. I cannot just tell, okay, prescribe, okay, these are the policies that you need to follow. What I want to say that it has to be determined by the unique social, economic, and political situation and cultural situation in Bangladesh. I know Bangladesh is also a diverse country. Then you have also refugees, a lot of internally displaced, externally and internally displaced people. And since feminist foreign policy always focuses on the marginalized people, how do we think about their welfare? Then I would think that feminist foreign policy in Bangladesh would also be responsive to the humanitarian need, because I think you have one of the largest refugee camp in the world. So significant humanitarian issue. So since feminist foreign policy is focuses on human security and humanitarian issues, I think that should be, I believe that should be the focus of feminist foreign policy there. But that's just my throwaway comment. But I'm sure you have a rich history of feminist movement there, women's activism in politics. You have women leaders who have been reigning for a very long time. I'm sure you have unique insight to provide for the world, for the South Asia, but also for the world.
So I want to add with you. So but I think political stability is an issue, right? To maintain political stability. I mean, not only in Bangladesh, in every country, right? Because political stability is a matter, right? For the feminist foreign policy or women empowerment or working on gender issues. Because if there is political instability, so we cannot work smoothly, right?
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Keshab. Okay.
Thank you, sir. So I'll be reciting all the questions now on. There are 4 more questions. So the next one is from Avni Sablokji. The question is, how do we decolonize the generational patriarchy that women carry with them while breaking the barriers to their empowerment and in leadership positions? So can I go with all the questions at once, or you want to take them?
I will go one by one. So the question is, how do we, what do we do about patriarchy that women themselves are sometimes carrying? Patriarchy is quite, it is subtle yet powerful force of institution. It is institution. It impacts us in our everyday life. How do we dress up? How do we eat? How do we move? And everything, right? It's a very subtle force. But also I want to say that patriarchy is quite resilient in a sense that it rewards people who follow patriarchal norms and practices. So that means any person of any gender can be susceptible to patriarchal ideals because it rewards them, right, in an intangible way. For example, just to say, if we see a woman fighting in war with valor, then she's she is always praised, right, by society, because that is patriarchal ideal. Similarly, being strong, acting in a ways that embodies masculinity is also rewarding. So in that sense, it can be anyone who can have these patriarchal ideals. But also I have to say that men always reap this kind of patriarchal dividend because of who they are, right? Because of their biology. But at the same time, we need to look at the way the masculinity operates in society. There are different versions of masculinity. We need to understand that some masculinities are hegemonic masculinities, but also there are suppressed masculinities within that. So the answer to the question, how do we be aware of patriarchy, is really difficult. There is no kind of fixed the bucket list, like these are the ways that we can get rid of patriarchy. But what I want to say is that we have to develop this kind of consciousness. We need to learn more from feminist theories, but also at the same time, it is not only about learning. We have to enact that theory into practice in our everyday life. The way we call names, right? It is also, it can be quite patriarchal. So we need to also think about the ways we can subvert patriarchy in our everyday life. And does that answer your question, or does it raise further questions?
Avni Sablok ji,
but also I want to add that, there are different layers, right? We can fight patriarchy. There are political avenues, legal avenues, social cultural avenues, economic avenues. Just to give you one example, in economic sphere, we can make workplace safe for women, right? That's one way to prompt the understanding that the men are always breadwinner. Although this is just one statement, right? But it carries a lot of meaning, a lot of impact into it, right? Because it prompts this kind of masculinist, protectionist logic that men always have to protect women, and women are always weaker, vulnerable. They cannot do anything on their own and things like that.
all right, sir. So the next question is from Sanya ji. She's from School of Gender Studies at Mahatma Gandhi University, Kerala. The question is, could you briefly explain how feminist foreign policy frameworks can move beyond femo-nationalism, femo-nationalist narratives, and integrate decolonial feminist principles to promote genuinely inclusive and anti-imperialist global policies that address intersectional power dynamics and avoid reinforcing neo-colonial structures?
That is a quite long and loaded question there. But what I want, I just discussed how do we decolonize a feminist foreign policy. I only talked about different conceptual framework, right? I did not give you some practical ways that we can decolonize feminist foreign policy. So one key principle of feminist foreign policy is diversity and inclusion. Now I will give you the practical ways we can do that. So foreign policy is also manifestation of domestic policy, right? You might have read this level two-level game by Robert D. Putnam. He talks about how domestic politics influences foreign policy, and foreign policy reinforces domestic policy. So they cannot be separated. So just to think about how do we diversify foreign policy, and how only having women in foreign service is an important, essential step, but that does not completely diversify. In Nepal, we became a federal republic in after 2008. There was a constitutional assembly, but our foreign policy does not think inclusion in terms of federalism. Right? There are some regions who always escape state attention in terms of resources distribution, in terms of focus. The leaders can always think those regions as expendable because they have little role to play in federal politics. So one way to decolonize that would be have some kind of representation in foreign office of the different regions of a country. For example, in India, that would be, how do we bring Northeast India into foreign policy? Right? So that means more representation from those states in foreign policy. So that in true sense bring that kind of intersectional diverse and inclusivity understanding and then praxis in foreign policy. That also makes all the regions take the ownership. Okay, this is also our country. We have also say in foreign policy. For example, to resolve refugee crisis in Northeast India between Manipur and Myanmar, what if Manipur had more influence in decision making about refugee? I think it would have been more, personally, I believe that it would have been more efficient and more effective if you given that power. I think there are some power, but also if we give them power in meaningful way. In the same way, I can think of Nepal and border provinces with India, because we have historic relationship between India and Nepal. We have roti beti relation. That means we have a system where there's cross-border marriage between states in Nepal, like Madhya state, and then also northern state of Bihar in India. So we have unique special relationship between those two countries. What if these two states have some kind of power to determine the relationship between them? So it will more democratize, right? And also it would be more inclusive. So this is the practical demonstration of inclusivity. At the same time, we can also decolonizing our understanding of a state as a unitary entity. Because if you look at realism, it comes from Westphalian understanding, which is a dominant paradigm in international relation discipline. That means there is no actor beyond the state level. The provinces or states in India, they don't have much power in that sense. So we are decolonizing and trying to reimagining new ways of being a state.
All right, sir. Thank you. Sir, there are 3 more questions. So if you could answer them in the Q&A box because of the shortage of time, or we could mail you the questions.
Yes, send it to me through email, because it would take a lot of time to type them here. And
sir.
I want you to wait while I type. So could you
No
send it my way, and then I will try to respond to all of them.
All right. Thank you, sir. Now I would like to invite Vibhuti ma'am to kindly share her closing remarks for the day.
I think both the sessions were mind-blowing. So many new concepts and ideas of current discourses in the among political scientists and political theorists have been discussed here with the gender lens. For the first, Dr. Sanjukta Bhattacharya's concern about the feminist foreign policy, the policy of a nation state that defines international relations as well as also social movements and other non-state actors who are all in a manner that prioritizes peace, gender equality, distributive justice, and environmental integrity. She gave a whole trajectory of last 100 years, I think after the First World War, the kind of discourses that took place, both from the state and non-state actors. And the second presentation by Dr. Keshab was also about the decolonizing feminist future, which enshrines and promotes and protects human rights of all, seeks to disrupt colonial, racist, patriarchal, hypermasculine, and male-dominated power structures and allocate significant resources, including research and advocacy and new vision. So I think what he said, the most important thing is the localizing universal human rights, because we have had a nearly 40 years of bitter, extremely bitter discourses about cultural nationalism, cultural relativism, and versus universal human rights, where the liberals took stand against, saying that, okay, if it is a question of female genital mutilation, we will respect African culture, but only thing we'll do is we'll do the same thing in a sanitized way, so that women don't die of septicemia. That was the kind of discourses one would hear at London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Now from there, I think this is the most progressive statement which Dr. Keshab has made about the localizing universal human rights. And I think for that, we don't have to go far, because we have a very strong historical and cultural legacies of liberative oral expressions right from the time of Therigathas by the Buddhist bhikkhunis in a BCE 80, which was earlier like generation after generations were imparted this liberative knowledge through oral tradition, and later on they were written in Pali language. And religious reform movement from 12th century to the 18th century throughout South Asia, whether it was a Lal Day or Habba Khatur or Mirabai in the 15th century, or Janabai or Bahnabai, or the 19th century social reform movements where Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain or Savitribai Phule, Fatima Sheikh, Tarabai Shinde, and all different parts of South Asia, we had the reform movement which fought against barbaric customs. At the same time, they were locally rooted. Marisi's work focuses on providing voice of the oppressed and marginalized women in African context. She was from Morocco. She was born in harem, and how she personally provided iconic figure that she became, and became a role model for so many African women to get out of the slavery and go for the education and empower themselves. We also have in front of us 15 women, freedom fighters who worked alongside Baba Saheb Ambedkar for formation of Constitution of India. And they not only talked about women's rights, but they went beyond the boundaries of caste, class, religion, and spoke about the rights of the marginalized. I think I strongly, and now there is a tremendous interest about these 15 women who were personally, who had fought against the very, very antiquated customs and traditions, and they fought for the larger causes of the nation building, women's liberation. Hansa Mehta, about which Keshab spoke, was one of them. And they also talked about the larger issues of human liberation and the solidarity. Intersectionality as a term was not there in 1947, but what they actually did was that. So I think we get our this whole universal rights, and whatever the feminist foreign policy is talking about, or even the WPS agenda with its 10 resolutions. I think from the localizing our, even now we are talking about localizing of sustainable development goal, within which also the gender equality in human relations and international relations come. A feminist slogan of personal is political. I think that is also being exemplified by this whole long tradition of the liberative efforts which came out in terms of verses and stories and actions and alternatives which these women provided. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So with this, I proceed to the formal vote of thanks. As we conclude day 2 session of Feminist Foreign Policy Fellowship, an online international winter school program, a 3-month immersive online introductory leadership certificate training fellowship program, I, Faza Mahajan, visiting researcher at IMPRI, would like to express my gratitude on behalf of the Asia Foundation, New Delhi, IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies, and IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center, New Delhi. I would like to thank our chair, Professor Vibhuti ji, and the experts for today, Professor Sanjukta and Dr. Keshab, for taking out their valuable time and for the thought-provoking insights on the topics. We would also like to thank our participants for raising important questions and contributing to the thoughtful dialogue that is essential to this fellowship. And the remaining questions, we'll mail them to the experts and forward you the answers to those questions. We look forward to seeing you all on November 1st, Friday, for our next session, which will feature Professor Vibhuti Patel, Dr. Deepika Maan, followed by a discussion on project selection. Thank you all for your engagement today. We hope that this fellowship will be a transformative and enriching experience for each of you. I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiza Mahajan, for moderating this good session. So beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, sir. It's nice knowing you.
Thank you,
and
sir.
listening to you. It was really a treat.